It's kind of wild to realise just how many composers in the 20th century plundered the music of one small island on the edge of the Indian Ocean, an island about the size of Kent. Bit like Kent with palm trees, rice terraces, surfers, monkeys. Surfing monkeys? I'm talking about the island of Bali. Don't believe me? Well, look at this veritable A to Z of 20th century composer pirates, all of whom caught the Bali bug. I mean, it's terrible, right? Another case of the dreaded cultural appropriation. Powerful Westerners stealing and profiteering from poorer, less powerful countries. So why would this Balinese composer say it's actually made his culture richer?
That thing is not kill our music, but it's make it more rich.
Is all this plundering really okay? What's so good about this music anyway? And why does Steve Reich call it dangerous?
Non-Western music to a Western composer is dangerous.
For over 250 years, Western composers had been sailing a ship they called the common practice. They'd all sailed along using the same old rule book. The rules included things like tonal harmony, time signatures, classic forms like sonata form, and throwing yourself overboard after your Ninth Symphony. Life on board the common practice was pretty well regulated, but attitudes towards alternative ways of sailing were pretty harsh. Captain Berlioz, who I always thought was one of the cool kids, heard some Indian and Chinese music at an exhibition in 1851 and said of it,
"They're still plunged in the dark depths of barbarism and in a childish ignorance where one can hardly detect some vague and impotent instincts. They give the name of music to what we should call a din."
At least they weren't called Hector, I suppose. Despite that unpleasantness, the common practice had been a sturdy, reliable vessel. But as each captain bolted on new tricks and techniques, it was becoming unfit for purpose. Meanwhile, the old certainties like religion and empire that had kept it afloat were losing their power. The timbers were beginning to creak, and soon enough the whole thing broke apart on the rocks. Adrift on the high seas, individual composers found themselves looking for ways to keep their music afloat. It's a scary place to find yourself. For most of human history, art has been something you created from within a tradition, but for them, and still for us today, it's a tradition that doesn't really function anymore. So we're left alone, stranded, trying to figure out what to do next. Is it even possible to make anything meaningful when you're not part of something bigger? And that's when you spot land, something glittering on the horizon. A sound world so different and strange that it promises you a way out of your terrible life clinging to driftwood.
It's dangerous because it's powerful. It's dangerous because it's beautiful.
It's called Gamelan, an orchestra, Jim, but not as we know it. Strings and woodwinds out, gongs and metallophones in. A shimmering sea of sound made mostly of metal. Gamelan is a tradition stretching back over 1,000 years. Most villages in Bali have their own gamelan, a collection of up to 30 or more instruments, stored carefully in the village temple and brought out as part of religious celebrations and rituals, but also since the rise of the fiery gong kebyar style in the early 1900s, just to have a good time and show off your crazy hammer skills. Neighbouring Java has its own gamelan, which, to vastly oversimplify, is generally more muted, with softer hammers and slower tempos. And by comparison, Balinese gamelan is vigorous, rhythmic and explosive. Today I think it's fair to say that all of Balinese culture is struggling a little under the weight of mass tourism, but in its original form, gamelan was such a uniquely radiant vision of music as a central part of life, ritual, religion and community that a lonely castaway could be forgiven for thinking it might be a mirage. So let's explore a few of gamelan's unique approaches to music making, how those approaches seeped into 20th century composition. Then we'll speak to a contemporary Balinese composer who brings some fascinating perspectives on whether all this is cultural theft or just healthy inspiration.
But when I saw Steve Reich's music the first time, I don't feel gamelan at all.
Claude Debussy was famously one of the first Western composers to encounter gamelan at a World Fair in Paris in 1889. Later exhibitions were visited by Ravel, Messiaen and others. These were very much colonial institutions designed to display the supposed treasures of colonial lands for the entertainment and education of Europeans. Entire cultures were staged as curiosities, almost as living museum pieces. It's a slightly uncomfortable place to find ourselves starting out. Other composers travelled to hear the music directly at source, but that wasn't necessarily any less problematic. I've come up with 4 archetypes for how our castaways responded to their encounters with the gamelan, although many composers are a mixture of all 4. The first is the souvenir hunter. This is the postcard writer, the tourist. Leopold Godowski is Exhibit A. Here he is modelling the 1920s exotic composer starter pack before hopping on a cruise of the Far East. After what we can only assume was a lovely time, he comes back and writes his Java Suite, 12 movements for piano solo. Godowski always had an amazing talent for piano writing, but it's a cultural encounter processed entirely through European romantic conventions.
My impressions in the native music idiom as I understood it,
he writes, whilst also noting that
the Javanese are a docile people.
The problem with the whole piece is this patronising, stereotyping tone, full of the mystical and otherworldly. The attempt at genuine understanding feels minimal. He's not really that interested, he's just showing off his holiday snaps, as you can see by some of these movement titles.
Non-Western music to a Western composer is dangerous.
But this isn't yet the danger Reich was talking about. It's more someone who grew up within the confines of the common practice, struggling to take the outside world more seriously. Next up, the mutineer. Like the souvenir hunter, they grab what suits their needs, but not for postcards. They arm themselves with it, using the new sounds as weapons to rebel against the old order and overthrow the rules they're sick of. Think of them as the naughty kids in the classroom, banging on the radiator just to see if the teacher flinches, except now the radiator is a whole orchestra. And Gamelan hands them plenty of weapons. The whole concept is wild, a tuned metal percussion orchestra. Back on the common practice, your typical orchestra had rows of violins, flutes and trumpets, with percussion tucked away in the back row. They did have a few tuned percussion, glockenspiel or tubular bells, but they were like the musical parsley, a garnish to sprinkle over your main meal. Here was a restaurant serving nothing but parsley. Tuned metal percussion from front to back. Composers keenly emulated this new sound world, firstly on standard Western percussion, as used for example by Olivier Messiaen in his epic Turangalila Symphony. In America, the approach was more DIY. Lou Harrison built what became known as the American Gamelan together with his partner William Colvig, and wrote pieces that often included weird and wonderful metallic objects like oxygen tanks as percussion instruments. On a slightly smaller scale, Xenakis tried his hand at building his own metal pipe instruments. And John Cage found that adding screws and bolts to pianos made it sound really naughty. Metal percussion is rebellious because it goes against almost everything in the Western tradition, by virtue of it being inharmonic. Inharwotic? Okay, you've heard of harmony, notes that sound nice together. Most orchestral instruments like the flute or the violin have harmony built into them. It's called the harmonic series. Every note they play isn't just one note, it's one main pitch plus a whole stack of overtones. Each overtone neatly and mathematically in place, double the frequency, triple, quadruple and so on, all neatly lined up like Englishmen in a post office.
Cashier number 4, please.
So the overall effect sounds good. But metal instruments work different. They have overtones too, but they're random and disorganised, like Englishmen at a bar.
Guinness, please.
The resulting sound is a bit more complicated, with multiple unrelated notes sounding at once. This is the inharmonic world of metal percussion. In fact, Balinese musicians don't think their metal instruments sound inharmonic enough, so they deliberately tune pairs of gangster instruments slightly apart to create a pulsing shimmer called ombak, which literally means wave. It's another example of very close dissonance being treated as beautiful, which I talked about in my dissonance video. All this, of course, was very different to life back on the common practice, but to the mutineers' ears, this was a liberation. Suddenly there were ways to justify things forbidden by the old rulebook. It was an excuse to be naughty. Maybe, for example, you could leave some gong-like notes ringing, even if they clashed with the chords above. Maybe you could imitate that shimmering ombak effect by using inharmonic sounding chords with clashing seconds. Or Or maybe you could make a sort of chime-like effect by moving inharmonic sounding chords around in parallel motion, so all the notes of the chord move together. This kind of thing would have earned you 40 lashes back on the common practice. But now it was fair game. Look, even Godowski's postcards have a bit of mutiny in them. For others, it's more of a violent overthrow. Messiaen went deep into the world of inharmonic sound, analysing the spectrum of these metal instruments and using them to create more very naughty new piano chords. So is all this mutineering influence or appropriation? For the most part, it feels like a healthy case of composers being inspired to write more for metallic instruments or explore inharmonic sounds. Hello?
This is just like the tune is like Javanese Gamelan.
Okay, sorry. There seems to be one of our examples so far that might be a bit more problematic. We'll come to that in a second.
Non-Western music to a Western composer is dangerous.
We've still not uncovered the danger Reich talks about, but we will with our next group, the Navigators. If the mutineer uses gamelan as a weapon, the navigator sets out to learn its ways and use it to navigate to new musical waters. But as we'll see, this is an approach which can go disastrously wrong. The navigator aims to move beyond the surface of the music and learn some deeper lessons. And one of the deep lessons of gamelan is its approach to time. Let's start with a very common gamelan surface, stratified layers moving at different speeds, a bit like the hands of a clock. In the middle you have the mid-paced minutes. Above, on the higher pitched instruments known as gangsa, the seconds whiz by. And beneath them, deep resonant gongs chime the hour. Early navigators found themselves using this kind of texture a lot, transferring the 3 layers of the gamelan onto the 2 hands of the piano. But it's way more than a simple texture. It's a different way of thinking about time itself. Bali has a unique ritual calendar called Pawukon. In this calendar there are multiple kinds of week. So a market week is a 5-day cycle, others are 4-day cycles, others are 7-day cycles, and so on. These weeks all cycle around each other, with particularly auspicious dates happening when more of the various cycles coincide. It's remarkably similar to the cycles of gamelan, with these auspicious dates being the equivalent of the deep gong that marks the completion of a larger cycle. And taken together, I think you can see that it's one of the fundamental differences between the West and Bali in terms of its philosophy of both time and music. In the West, time moves forward like a road, with an endless sense of progress and change. In Bali, time is multi-layered. Like a kaleidoscope, its different elements are always changing in relation to each other, but something is also staying the same. It took Western composers some time to absorb the full implications of gamelan's approach to time, but you could see it starting to affect their music with the introduction of far more static sounding passages. Erik Satie attended the same World Trade Fair as Debussy, and even if the gamelan influence wasn't directly acknowledged, you could feel a change in the air, a sense of willingness to let things circle, float and repeat more than before. Satie's influence and approach to time affected the outlook of many later composers, including John Cage and Steve Reich, but Reich's starting point was slightly different. His interest centred on an intricate interlocking technique known as kotakan, demonstrated here by Augustin Esterhammer. Reich studied this technique in one particular Balinese piece, and there are sketches where you can see him pulling apart its intricacies. If you then compare this to similar techniques he uses in pieces like Six Pianos and Drumming, the resemblance is striking. But to give such patterns time to register and evolve, you find you have to completely alter your relationship with time. Anyone who's sat in a Western concert hall and listened to a Steve Reich piece is accustomed to the mental adjustment required when listening to his music. Time shifts onto a slower plane. You end up focusing in on the micro detail, the small changes that occur moment to moment. It's a completely different interaction than with, say, a Beethoven symphony. Important though to remember that when we heap praise on Reich for such innovations, we're really praising ideas that have lived for centuries in Balinese music.
Non-Western music to a Western composer is dangerous.
So what exactly is Reich talking about when he talks about non-Western music being dangerous? Well, I think we can see the answer in the case of two very different composers, both of whom I think had the most prolonged and in-depth interaction with gamelan, and probably saw it as some sort of solution to navigate their music into new terrain, but who ended up crashing on its rocks. Colin McPhee was a true pioneer of Balinese studies. He lived there for 8 years and wrote the first comprehensive analysis of Balinese music written in English. And the story goes that local musicians were grateful for his tireless efforts to document and preserve their traditions. That's the official line, but the more I look at it, the more I start to wonder. As a composer, his most successful piece is undoubtedly Tabu Tabuhan, which opens sounding like Steve Reich 40 years earlier. But this piece aside, he never quite escapes his inspiration and creates something genuinely original. And I think Steve Reich has the answer as to why.
Non-Western music to a Western composer is dangerous. It's dangerous because it's powerful. It's dangerous because it's beautiful. It's dangerous because it has a very, very long, very solid tradition behind it. And when a Western composer who is an individual and who represents really nothing but himself and whatever now derailed tradition that he's left faces it, it's a little bit like a man sitting by himself in front of a cyclone.
For McPhee, Bali's music was such a cyclone. He fell in love with it so much, his composing career stalled, and he seems to have lost the sense of his own creative voice. And for someone who loved Balinese culture so much, even when he did write, there seemed to be a surprising lack of respect. Gambangan from McPhee's grand ceremonial music is presented as his transcription of a folk piece. His name sits alone on the score. But the piece wasn't anonymous. It had a composer, Iwayan Lottring. McPhee knew him well, studied with him, even wrote that Lottring's name was known from one end of Bali to the other. Yet in McPhee's published work, the Balinese name somehow vanishes. It becomes a certain Balinese musician. Imagine writing that about a man you knew personally while also signing your own name to his work. It's the strongest case for pure cultural appropriation that I've seen so far. Happily, Lottring continued playing and dancing into his 80s, but I think he deserves a lot more appreciation and recognition. Although he was more successful than McPhee, I think Lou Harrison also has some problems. He too studied and researched gamelan music in considerable depth. He too sometimes seems to lose his own voice in the cyclone of gamelan's influence. Let's hear from Balinese composer Dewa Alit.
Because lyrics, and he also has been make his instrument, for example, like Japanese gamelan in Western music. Even his gamelan called Tibeti, this is just like the tune is like Japanese gamelan. And when I heard his music, I can see very close in his relative in his music and Japanese gamelan like that. But at least his music is like, it really mixed in between gamelan and Western culture like that.
Alit described it as nonsense when I suggested that maybe there was a problem with the way Lou Harrison often seems to have a Western instrument as the soloist, with the gamelan in a subservient accompanying role. But others do find this problematic. Such pieces can be interpreted as making the power imbalance between colonisers and their native subjects seem aesthetically beautiful, writes Spiller and Clendening in this book, and I'll leave you to make your own mind up about that. Before we get to our final category, let me just say a word more about Dewa Alit, who we heard from there. I became very conscious that this video was a Westerner's take on Western ways of taking from Bali. If McPhee is guilty of stifling Balinese voices, I didn't want to do the same. So I wanted to find someone who knew both the composers I'm talking about, but also Balinese culture from the inside. Alit grew up in Bali with a musician father, and previously worked as a gamelan player himself.
I play a lot for temple, I play a lot for tourists, I play a lot for festival, just like every day I heard gamelan in my life.
But in recent years, he's developed his own custom gamelan, Gamelan Salukat, which has its own unique tuning that Alit composes for. He's also composed for well-known Western ensembles like Ensemble Moderne and New York's Bang on Account Festival. If if you're tempted, like I was initially, to draw a distinction between what Alit does and what you might think of as a traditional gamelan composer, I think you should reconsider. Gamelan is an evolving creative tradition and ever was. The compositions of Lottering from the 1920s were startlingly innovative and original in their day, and if you have any lingering doubt he's a composer just like the rest of us, have a listen to this quote attributed to him in Colin McPhee's book A House in Bali.
Get why it's hard to compose. Sometimes I can't sleep for nights thinking of a new piece. It turns round and round in my thoughts. I hear it in my dreams. My hair has grown thin thinking of music.
Yeah, he's a composer. And Alit himself describes some very familiar challenges of life as a composer.
It's still hard to me to get appreciation. For example, like my group, called Gamelan Salukat, because we play like, let's say, new music, it's hard to find place for perform. It's still hard to find appreciation to the public.
Yeah, well, that's the same everywhere.
Yeah.
So please, let's stop considering some composers as invisible folk composers and others, usually Westerners, as real composers. A gamelan composer is a composer, and Dewa Alit is just the latest iteration of that tradition. So back to our archetypes, and our final category I'll call the standing man.
Standing man.
These composers stand tall in the cyclone, hold true to their course, learn from the foreign culture, but respect it, take it seriously and deeply. I want to place two of our composers in this category, both of whom we've already met. Debussy's encounter with gamelan was only a few short days in 1889, but we know from his letters he was still talking about it many years later. The impact in his music is not always immediately obvious. We're not talking about an imitation gamelan effect. We're talking about a deep integration into his musical language of approaches to time, texture, colour, melody, pattern, harmony, and more. We've seen a few examples already. Kiyoshi Tamagawa's book has a lot more if you're interested. What's particularly impressive is how seriously Debussy takes Indonesian culture given the prevailing attitudes of the time. And the second composer is Steve Reich himself. It's shocking to notice how similar in lineup a piece like Music for 18 Musicians is to gamelan. Pitched percussion are the main course, winds and voices are the parsley. And there are other gamelan-derived or related aspects, the repetitive interlocking patterns, the fixed pulse, the sense of long-lasting harmonic stasis, and yet it sounds so unlike gamelan that the connection is rarely observed.
When I saw Steve Reich's music the first time, I don't feel gamelan at all.
For Dewa Alit, this kind of influence is not just okay, he sees it as something actually beneficial to Balinese culture.
My feeling is this is like a mirror for Balinese composer or musician because we can see the different perspective how Western composer using our music like gamelan on their music. So we can learn about that also. It doesn't matter it's good and bad. We can learn not just about good thing, also a bad thing. But at least that thing is not kill our music, but it's make it more rich.
It's a beautiful sentiment, and let's end the video there while we're all feeling in a good mood. Okay, if you really want to stay around longer, I don't want to say more because I really like bringing positivity to the world, but I haven't yet found a positive angle on what I'm about to say. I mentioned earlier that Balinese culture is struggling under the pressure of mass tourism. I recently joined those masses myself, reluctantly I might add. My son has been living in Bali for the past year, and it was a way-in between my environmental awareness and my lack of love for holidays on one hand, versus my love for my family and the time we have together on the other. I guess it's a common dilemma, abstract, high-minded principles versus immediate personal love and connection. There was also, of course, a strong desire to get a whiff of the gamelan, although even before I went, I'd heard about the tourism, the traffic jams, and I was concerned for its health. In the end, all I managed was a couple of the tourist shows at Ubud, which was still great, but I did manage to track down a gamelan factory, which was pretty fascinating. I mean, who knew you use power drills to make a gong? After spending 10 days in Bali, the sense of the power of the culture on this island is overwhelming. Life before tourism seems to have been focused around art in a way that I think is completely unique. Whole villages are devoted to sculpture, or to wood carving, or painting, or dance, or music. Speaking later to Dewa Alit confirmed this.
In my village, almost all people they sculpture, the painter, or the musician. But when I was a kid, that it's so strong, just art everywhere. Even you go to river, people just make a sculpture on the river.
Yeah,
it's just for the happiness.
Even on the fully westernized streets of Canggu, you could still occasionally hear a gamelan from behind closed doors. Still notice the intricately designed temples that sit now incongruously jammed in between surf shops and bars advertising happy hours. The culture still exists, but it was impossible to avoid the sense of an enormous boot of tourism flattening and destroying all this beautiful culture in a way that I found depressing beyond words. And most of this has just happened in the last 10 years. Here's 2025 compared to 2012.
Now, today, most people here work for tourists, and they still have land. They rent to the people to make business here, and some of them they sell their land. So today they still have money for that, so they can stay in the in the community, just play gamelan or make a ceremonial like that. But I don't know in 50 years later what gonna be happen.
Yeah,
We lost everything. So how are we gonna keep the culture? So to me, this danger. And the rich people just came here just building hotel, villa, just under control now today.
It's tempting in a video that's discussing the West's plundering of Balinese culture to say that this Western tourism is the real criminal. But this isn't really a problem of the West versus Bali, it's a problem of humanity. Many of the Balinese I spoke to were very glad of the income tourism provided, and if anything, blamed the government and bad planning for the fact that some of the streets are a permanent traffic jam, which may well be true. But even if it were better planned, the society and culture that brought gamelan into the world is fast disappearing. Materialism is a drug that's impossible to resist for any of us. We all, myself included, would rather have a flat screen TV, a nice car, a nice marble top bathroom, and nice trips abroad, even if it means losing minor things like, community, culture, our connection to nature and the planet itself. The culture that created gamelan just can't survive in this kind of world.
Yes, because we are live on social, community. So we live in the social life on materialistic system. Everything we have to buy, but we work with the payment.
It feels pretty devastating, and I'm trying to find some hope to end on, and all I've got is this: to keep listening, to keep noticing the moments when beauty still cuts through the noise, whether it's a gamelan behind a closed door, a flower growing in the gutter, or a passing sense of connection with a stranger. To remember that these things matter, because if these things can vanish, it also means they can be protected, nurtured, and even reborn. And if there's any hope at all, it lies in refusing to treat art, nature, culture, and community as expendable, in recognizing, before it's too late, that it's these things that make life worth living.
David Bruce, 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 David Bruce.